And welcome to another edition of Scott Wheeler's Airplay, where we go behind the scenes to meet some Peoria radio and television personalities and get to know them a little bit off the mic. We're airing on Peoria Life's web portal, peorialife.com, on Facebook Live at the moment, and you can also check out this episode and past episodes on YouTube, Peoria Life's YouTube channel, or on Peoria TV, channel 17 on the i3 broadband system. I'm Scott Wheeler from Super Hits 102.7 FM and 1290 AM WIRL. And today we talk to a guy who tells you where to go every morning as traffic on Traffic One on some of Peoria's top radio stations. Ken Zurski is here. Ken is also an author of 3 books, so we're going to talk to him about that. Ken, welcome.
Scott, how are you? Thanks.
I'm doing great. So, got to talk about the traffic career first. When I first heard you, you were actually in the Chicagoland area,
yes,
using the name Grant Park.
Yes.
Which has got to be the all-time best stage name in radio ever if you're working in Chicago.
That's an interesting story. Most of the traffic reporters at the time were doing multiple radio stations. Mm-hmm. For a group, there was shadow traffic at the time in Chicago. And we started doing reports for WLS radio there in Chicago. And the program director, because we were using our real name on another station, he goes, well, we got to come up with some other name. Mm-hmm. And of course, usually you get to pick, and it's just usually you pick a grandfather's name or it's an uncle's name or whatever. And he goes, well, I think I'll choose. So he started picking all these names that had some, tie-in to a Chicago landmark like Grant Park. There was Ike Stevenson. There was a Carroll Stream.
That's awesome.
So we were able to kind of incorporate this. I was able to kind of latch on to a talk show that was on in the evenings and kind of became a little bit of a co-host there. So the Grant Park thing kind of stuck with me. I still get emails from people going, I remember you as Grant Park. They actually recognize the voice. And when I came here to Peoria, which will be 16 years.
That is amazing.
16 years
Seems
this
like
July.
Yesterday.
Yeah, and we could talk about why we came, but when I did come here 16 years ago, everyone kept saying, "You gonna use Grant Park?" I'm like, would that make sense here? And then everyone started coming up with their own names. How about Detweiler Park? And so it was kind of a funny thing. I go, you know what? I think I'll just use my real name.
So how did that all begin for you? How did you end up doing traffic in Chicago?
Well, I'm sure that there was talk before I even came here when Upgrade 74 was just, the meetings were going on. I'm sure you were in a few of the radio meetings there when you're talking about, well, let's get a traffic service together because the bridge is going to be shut down. It was part of the project, but it was a 4-year-long project. Mm-hmm. And for 6 months, they're going to shut down the Murray-Baker Bridge, I-74. And so all that was kind of brewing before I actually sent an email to the radio group. I had met my wife through mutual friends in 1999 in Chicago. So we had been together 4 years, and every weekend I had really been coming down here and seeing her. So I kind of knew the area, didn't know it very well, but just a little bit of it. I wasn't unfamiliar with it. And so when we were going to get married in 2003, I sent an email down here. My wife has a very big family. So I was coming down here, and they're all still here. So I was coming here. And so I sent an email to the radio group through a friend of mine, Greg Batten, was working in Chicago at the time. He's now back working here. He's been here for a while, mornings. And I asked him, I said, what's the good radio group? He goes, well, you got to send it here. So I did, and it was just perfect timing because they're like, whoa, we know who you are, Grant Park, right? And we're looking for a traffic report. I had been doing news and traffic in Chicago for 15 years on the radio station. Okay. So it was kind of a perfect marriage there too, So I was getting married, and it was kind of a good marriage with the radio group. And we started up in August of 2003, and then it was a year or so later, maybe 2 years, when they shut down the bridge, and that was obviously a big deal. And now it's like we're coming full circle because
it's happening again.
It's happening again.
Don't leave.
I had to do the double take when I heard it. I'm like, really?
Didn't we just do this?
Yes, right. And so how interesting is that going to be now for us? That's the reason why we started. Now we've kind of established ourselves as the radio and traffic service, and and now we get to do it all over again.
It's like the old joke: you paint the bridge, you get to the end of it, and then you start.
You have to start over again, right? So yeah, I was really shocked by that. And I thought, well, how interesting is that going to be?
And when is that happening?
That's happening in April of next year.
Oh boy!
And they're adding on a month. It's going to be 7 months long that it's closed. So maybe we're just used to it, So they figured, let's add
we got them now.
Yeah, right.
Is it my imagination, or is the entire city under construction right now? I really think there is not a road that's open.
It seems that way, doesn't it? Here's the thing. When I got here, I was told this was a 20-minute town. Now there really wasn't any traffic service established here.
Right.
We were really starting from scratch and trying to figure out, what are we going to do? What are we going to report? What's the format going to be? How are we going to pace this? In Chicago, it's pretty easy. It goes quickly. Usually the news stations, the all news stations, they want a format of, Dan Ryan, I-57, you go Eisenhower, you go down the line, so people, when they listen to it, they can get familiar with the spot at which they're going to be concerned about. And it's travel times. Here, obviously, you don't have travel times, and you don't have set, you have an interstate that goes through town, but you don't have a set travel time for things. And so it was more about information, and it was also more about that 20-minute town that everyone talks about. You can go from 20 minutes from one end to the other in any direction.
That's not true anymore. It can't
Okay,
be.
that was 16 years ago. Let's add on another 10 minutes. But here's the thing, as far as traffic reports here go, you expect to get to work on time, right? That's what you expect. And so when you tune in, most of the time you're going to hear everything is fine, and whether you're listening for something or not. And then there's going to be that one day where it's going to affect your route, and then that's the day maybe you even missed it. You go, and so we really had to concentrate on taking stuff that obviously was going to have the most impact on traffic. Of course, got I-74 and 474, and kind of focus on that, and obviously the accidents and all the other incidents that happen come along with it too. So. It seems to me that there's, I say this too, I used to do 70 plus reports when I did the split shift, both did a morning and afternoon reports. Now I just do mornings, about 45 reports get broadcast in the morning. Yeah, and I always say I've never had nothing to talk about. There's always been something going on, and it's mostly a lot of information. Yes, it's about what's coming up or what's happening, and then suddenly you get into like the 7-8 o'clock hour. I call it a rush hour. It truly is a rush hour here, and that's when the road work starts to cause those slowdowns, and then mix in all the accidents and other things, and there's always something to say.
We're talking with Ken Zurski, who is the director and morning reporter for Traffic One, which you hear on many of Peoria's top radio stations every morning. But about, 7 years ago, you stopped doing the split shift so that you could devote time to, of all things, becoming an author.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Well, I say it's as much a happy accident as it is a pleasant surprise. I'm a journalist, and I love finding stories and researching things and doing a lot of newsy part of that stuff. And you don't really do that with traffic. It's immediate. It's there and you have it, and then it's done. And so I was reading a book about the Eastland Disaster. Now, the Eastland was a steel steamer that tipped over in the Chicago River. It's the worst boat wreck in Illinois history, and that's happened on the Chicago River. And that happened in 1916. And I was telling my cohort there, Greg Batten from WMVD, that I was reading this book, and it was fascinating because I find these stories about disasters, these tragedies, to have so many levels to them. There's the shock, of course. There's the event itself, the shock, the grief, and then you get the anger. People want to know who's to blame for this. Then you get a legal part of it, and it was all there. And in the mix of all that are all these testimonials, these people's stories, because there are survivors who tell their stories. And Greg said, interesting. There was a boat wreck that happened in Pekin. He didn't know what year it was or how many people had died. died. I go, really? And I had no idea.
Really?
And so I started looking it up, and there were things that were already been written about it, and certainly in Pekin, where most of the people were from, who were on the Columbia, there were stories there. And as I started digging deeper into it, there were kind of points of the story where I thought I could fill in, mostly what happened after the boat, right, the legal part of it. And the story always ended with the captain and the pilot were never faced a jury, even though they were indicted. And that part wasn't told yet. And I just thought to myself, I have no idea whether I could write a book. I mean, you just don't do that. And the whole prospect of it didn't really sound very appealing to me, because I knew it would be a lot of hard work. Yeah. But I had all this research, and I just loved going into libraries and going through the microfilms and looking at all this stuff. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And being a broadcaster, and being a broadcaster for many years, you tell stories on the air. You just do it with your voice. And it just seemed that transition just seemed kind of easy for me to kind of go from what I was thinking, instead of bringing it out here, to kind of do it on the computer and put it to words. And after the book came out in 2012, it was interesting when I was doing the research for the book. I had put a kind of feeler out in one of the Historical Society's newsletters that I was working on this book. I didn't really give my name or anything. I didn't want to do that, but I just said, I'm a writer, and I'm doing some research on the Columbia. If you have any stories, any of your ancestors had a story to tell, please contact me. And I didn't get any responses, none.
Really?
And I thought, boy, I knew this was a kind of a forgotten story, but I thought, does anybody, and then the book came out in 2012, and I started doing talks. In fact, I did an event at the Pekin Library, which is kind of an introduction to the book and me, and it was packed, and people come up to me and they started telling me their stories about their great aunt who was on the boat, or those who they wanted to go on the boat and they just missed it, and stuff like that. And you know what? I get it. My dad was in World War II. He hardly talked to us at all about the war, unless he met another veteran, and then it was like hours they were talking, right? Well, here I think people just didn't. It's a personal thing, and it was a personal thing, I think, when it was told, and now as it goes down through generations, and I think they just didn't know what I was doing there. But then they got something physical, and there it was, and then they were able to kind of open up. And I thought to myself, I didn't feel like any of the stories that they told me is something I could have included, because most of the stories they were telling me are a lot of the stories of their ancestors who were in the newspaper too. I go, I recognize the name. I tell them, or read it because it's in the book. And but I do think that there might be something that some of the historical societies can do of getting some of these stories, getting these people to write these stories down of what their great aunt told them. Maybe that could be another book.
You're going to have to do the second edition.
Yeah, right.
So The Wreck of the Columbia came out in 2012.
Yes.
What was a misconception you had about writing, do you think, that you learned when writing that first book, that, boy, this isn't anything like I thought it would be?
Yeah, well, it's just, it's time consuming. And truthfully, there is a point where you sort of block yourself out. And as long as you know your direction, you want to give yourself the time to stop, and that time to just kind of relax and let things flow, because that's they call it writer's block, and certainly that's what it is. And instead of getting angry at yourself, you just have to stop and go, let me just take it out of my head for a while, and then eventually it starts to work its way back in. And then you start flowing again. And so as long as you can give yourself that time to stop, and that was the best thing about being an independent writer and working for an independent publishing company. At the time when I was writing, I didn't have the publishing company. So I was really just kind of like going, well, maybe it'll be a book, maybe it won't. But I had that time to really kind of, stop, give it a break, and move along. So I'd heard about writer's block, and I thought, oh, is that going to happen? And it's like, it certainly does.
Really interesting. So you enjoyed it enough to take a stab at another book, the Peoria Stories book. Now that's I hate to ask you to single out a story, but I think that's unique in that everybody probably knows or has heard the legend of one or two of those stories. Give me a little synopsis of that one.
Well, I was asked to write some Peoria stories, or stories about Peoria, by the Peorian magazine. And when I thought about it, I go, well, you know what? I'm not from here. And most of the historians that I knew from here, Norm Kelly, even going back to Bill Adams and Jerry Klein, they're from here. So, their stories were told kind of firsthand, like, oh, I remember when I used to play there, or they had the city in their blood, in their heart. And of course, I couldn't write that way about the. I mean, it wasn't my hometown. But what I thought I could do is take some famous figures, influential people, and show their ties to Peoria. And it all started with, of course, the famous Teddy Roosevelt calling Grandview Drive the world's most beautiful drive. Now, we all know he said that, but I was thinking, well, why did he say that? Why was he here? What did he really mean by that? So I started doing research on that, and that was really the first story I wrote, and became the anchor story of the book. So there's 9 stories in there. There's Charles Lindbergh, who used to fly the airmail over Peoria, from St. Louis to Chicago, literally months before he made his famous flight across the Atlantic, and crash landed a few times. One just outside of Bloomington.
Cornfield here or there.
Yeah, he was flying over Peoria, ran into the fog. And of course, back then, the airplanes didn't have instrument control like they do now. I mean, basically, if you were in a bad situation, couldn't land a plane, you jumped out of the plane. You had a parachute on, but you just ditched the plane. That's what he did a couple times in the Peoria area. So, and there's a tie into William Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton's kind of hot now with the musical, and there's a tie of Alexander Hamilton's son William, who was one of the first surveyors of the town of Peoria, and of course Lincoln. You got to go with Lincoln with Peoria, and the thing is that with Lincoln, he's known for one day in Peoria, and that's the Peoria Speech. And it's why we have a statue in the courthouse, of course, for that Peoria Speech. And that's a fascinating story in itself. There was one historian who called that speech one of the most influential or famous, or most important speeches in the nation, because they had to do with slavery. And the first time that Lincoln really, said that slavery was wrong on all levels. And so I had to include that, and I kind of tied that into kind of Lincoln's legacy and his inaugural train. We all know the funeral train came back to Illinois, but his inaugural train, which went from Springfield to Washington, D.C., and when he left Illinois and said goodbye, he was saying goodbye for the last time. As a president, he never did come back, and of course we know. And so I thought, well, there's my Lincoln story. And I actually have 2 Lincoln stories in here, which is amazing, because, I mean, what else can you write about Lincoln? But he was involved in a strange court case in Metamora, which I was able to include in that.
I remember watching the Lincoln movie, and Metamora is referenced in there.
Yeah, that's where I found out that story, and I did some more research on that. Yes.
So Peoria Stories is kind of about people we know, and then your third book, the Unremembered book, is lesser known but interesting stories nonetheless.
Yeah, I was always felt like I was always kind of going to branch out of being local specific to something that was really global. And I'm an avid reader of history books, and I always found these names in these books on other subjects that were interesting people. They were what I say were, and I know this is a subjective word, being famous, but they were famous for their time. And what was interesting to me was that I didn't know who they were. And in the book, they were maybe just a page or 2. And usually the author would say, oh, they were really famous at this time. But I thought, well, what made them famous? Why do we not know them now? So what made them unremembered? And so there's about 70 different people fall under the category in here of people who I kind of tag it with famously interesting, mostly forgotten. People who, and I say famous, they made the headlines. They were just people who you think about. I use an example like you say today, like Robert Mueller. That name we know today. I mean, someone says it, you know it just because he's in the news. 100 years from now, somebody will say, but back in 2019, that was a name that was on. So it's kind of like that. And but they're all people who, I mean, back in it's mainly 19th century. Maybe early 20th century, but mostly in that 19th century, which was a fascinating century because that's when industry and manufacturing was all started. So you had all these people who were inventing things, and some of these people were trying to, make things and perfect things, and they did, but then someone came along who was named Bell or is named Edison, who kind of, did something a little bit better, and that's the one we remember now. But these are kind of the people who are kind of underneath them, but kind of had the first wave of fame and celebrity for things that they did.
Okay. So you and I were talking before we got started that you do the majority of your writing before you go to work, the other job you have doing traffic, which starts at 5. When do you get up and write? In the middle of the night?
Pretty much, yes.
Really?
Well, with having to, I say when I started working on the Columbia book in 2010, my kids are now 12 and 14, so they were much younger then. And the quietest time of the house would be in the morning.
I get that.
So I would get up. Normally I get up about 2:30. I get to work about 4, and so I would get up around 1 and start working.
Wow.
But I found that my brain was just sharp.
Really?
I'm
Not me.
Some people are early risers. And so I would get most of my work done in the early morning before I went to work. Yeah.
So what advice would you give someone, go back 7 years when you were starting this process, who thought, I'd like to write a book.
Yeah.
What do they need to know?
Yeah, don't go any further than where you're at. It's like a lot of people come to me and they say, hey, they want to talk to the publisher, and publishers don't want ideas necessarily. They want work. They want what you have. So I just say, write your book. Any idea is a good idea. Write your book, and then start worrying about, getting it out to people or trying to find a publisher. I think people make the mistake that they get frustrated because they start writing, but they're thinking too far ahead, like, oh, this isn't good enough. And don't think that way either. There are good professional people out there who can help you shape what you have.
Okay.
Just put it down and write it. And I think a lot of people give up because they think, I got a great story, whether it's nonfiction or even a fiction story. I got a great story, and I want to tell it, and then they start telling people, and maybe they even pitch it to a independent publisher right away, and the publisher's just going to say, well, just write the book. I mean, that's mainly it. Before you get
Simple as that.
before you get any commitment. And I was almost done with the Columbia when I was contacted this Amica Press in Chicago, and so it's like, send me the manuscript, and then they'll look it over and go from there. So, but don't get frustrated. That's the main thing. And even if you write something and it doesn't even get into a book form, I mean, look what you've done.
Yeah.
And a lot of writing, I think today is personal. They're writing about someone. If you're writing about a real event or story, you're writing about one of your ancestors or someone you know, or a story that you've been told. So, and that's the way to keep history alive. I tell these people who tell me the stories about the Columbia, I say, write this down for prosperity's sake, and give it to your children and to give to their children so it doesn't die. I mean, history is remembered because it's recorded.
Right.
Either someone transcribed it, like Lincoln. I mean, had he not transcribed his Peoria speech, we would have known. There was a speech by Douglas on the same day that Lincoln gave a speech. He didn't transcribe his speech, so we don't know. That could have been a great speech. We just don't know. But Lincoln did. So either the history is told through those who transcribed their own work, or were told something and then wrote it down. We still have to do that today.
So how do I get these books? Where are they available?
They're all available online, any of the outlets. Amazon's obviously the big one. I do have my books available in the Peoria Riverfront Museum store. They carry that. Barnes & Noble, you can go in store and order. I believe they have Unremembered in stock, and you might have to order the other two. You can go bookstore here locally, or like I said, online. It's on all the outlets.
And wasn't the Wreck of the Columbia turned into a musical?
It was.
That's amazing.
Well, see, last year was the 100th year anniversary, and it was quite an honor for me to go to all these commemorations. And it wasn't on my bucket list to, when I wrote it, I knew that the 100th year anniversary was coming up. So, but I knew I'd be starting working on some other books, and I didn't think I was going to be able to plan any of that. I was hoping that a lot of the historical groups and societies would pick that up, and they certainly did. And they had a ceremony by the riverfront around July 5th, which is the anniversary of the wreck. The local PBS station did a documentary, The Sinking of the Columbia, which I was a part of, and there was a friend I knew through Amica Press who is a retired educator, and he's an author and a musician, and he put together a musical. I say musical. It's basically a reader's theater presentation with original music, and so it's characters. There were about 15 people in the troupe. And they played 3 or 4 different characters, and you basically walked up to the podium and you read these monologues and these stories of people. They were character eyewitnesses, and he performed that at 2 libraries in the Chicago area. And in August of last year, they brought it here to the Peoria Public Library. My wife and I were actually part of the cast for the Peoria.
Were you really? Oh yes. Did you get to make a cameo?
Yes, I played the pilot, and I forget who else I was. I was one of the witnesses on the boat, but. It was a lot of fun, and we got a great crowd for that, and it was just a neat way, and that was really kind of with the anniversary being July and bringing it here in August. It was a neat way to kind of end what was a year-long commemoration, the 100th year commemoration. I call it a forgotten story, and I still believe that there are that it's not so widely known, but of course after last year, the 100th year anniversary, it got much more exposure. After the last survivor passed away, I believe it was 2006, they really didn't hold any of it. I mean, before then they had something, that someone could talk about, and then when she died, and she was 106 when she passed away, she was just a teenager on the boat in 1918, but after she passed away, that kind of, the historical societies, they still held a few things, but annually they didn't do anything by the river, and so it was nice to kind of come back and last year and have a nice ceremony, and they rang the fire truck bell for all the victims, read off all the names.
Well, dream come true for you.
Yeah, it's really cool. I didn't expect much with the writing stuff, and it's just been a thrill, and it's been a wonderful journey with the Columbia, especially because that's such a local a local story. So it's been a nice ride.
Our guest today, Ken Zurski, the director and reporter for Traffic One in the morning across many radio stations here in Peoria, and a pretty prolific author. So make sure to pick up one or all 3 of his books. And don't forget that PeoriaLife.com is where you can see future episodes of Airplay and past ones as well. Also YouTube, Peoria TV, Channel 17 on i3 Broadband. Until next time, it's Scott Wheeler for Airplay.
PeoriaLife.com